The Way Up to Heaven, a short story by Roald Dahl, adapted by Helmer Hermans. Mr. and Mrs. Foster lived in a large 6-story house in New York City, where they had 4 servants. Few people came to visit them. On this particular morning in January, the house had come alive, and there was a great deal of bustling about. Mrs. Foster herself, all dressed for travel, was flying from room to room, pretending to supervise the goings-on. Actually, she was thinking of nothing at all, except that she was going to miss her plane if her husband didn't come out of his study soon and get ready. All her life, Mrs. Foster had had an almost pathological fear of missing a train, a plane, a boat, or even a theatre curtain. Mr. Foster had developed the habit of increasing her misery by keeping her waiting unnecessarily. Anxiously, she began walking up and down the hall, because this was the one plane she must not miss. She was going all alone to Paris to visit her daughter, her only child, who was married to a Frenchman. She was very fond of her daughter and yearned to set eyes on her 3 grandchildren, whom she only knew from photographs. At 22 minutes past 9, a door opened and Mr. Foster came into the hall. "Well," he said, "I suppose we perhaps had better get going fairly soon if you want to catch that plane." "Yes, dear, yes. Everything is ready. The car is waiting." "I'll be with you in a moment," he said. "I'm just going to wash my hands." When he had finally come down again, he sat beside her in the car and the chauffeur drove off. "Looks a bit foggy," he said. "Don't say that, dear, please." "I've arranged everything with the servants," said Mr. Foster. "They're all going off today, and I will move into the club tonight. I told the butler I'd send him a telegram when we wanted them to come back." They slowly drove on in thickening fog. Finally, the driver stopped the car and announced they had arrived at the airport. Without a word, Mrs. Foster jumped out and hurried into the building. There was a mass of people standing around the ticket counters. She pushed her way through and spoke to the clerk. "Yes," he said, "your flight is temporarily postponed, but please don't go away. We're expecting this weather to clear any moment." Mrs. Foster went back to the car, to her husband, and told him the news. "But don't you wait, dear," she said. "There's no sense in that." So they said goodbye, the car drove off, and Mrs. Foster was left alone. The rest of the day she sat for hour after hour on a bench. It wasn't until after 6 in the evening that the loudspeakers finally announced that the flight had been postponed until 11 o'clock the next morning. Dazedly she went in search of a phone and called the house. Her husband, who was on the point of leaving for the club, answered it himself. She told him the news and asked whether the servants were still there. "They've all gone," he said, "but get yourself a taxi and come home." It was a long, slow drive in the taxi, and she didn't arrive back at their house until fairly late. "We leave again at 11 in the morning," she said. "It is definite. The fog will clear. There's a wind picking up." "I will order a car for 9 in the morning," he said. "I'll not come with you to the airport, but there's no reason why you shouldn't drop me at the club on your way. You'll have plenty of time." Next morning, Mrs. Foster was up early, and by 8:30 she was downstairs and ready to leave. Shortly after 9, her husband appeared. "Did you make any coffee?" he asked. "No, dear. I thought you'd get a nice breakfast at the club. The car is here." He then remembered he had left his cigars, so he went back up to his room again. When he finally came down, it was 20 past 9, so he settled himself beside her in the car. The chauffeur started the car. "Just a moment," said Mr. Foster suddenly. "I had a little present I wanted you to take to Ellen, a little box wrapped in white paper." He searched every pocket of his coat and felt every pocket in his jacket. "Oh, please," she cried, "we haven't got time. Please leave it. You can mail it." "I'm going up again in the house to get it," he said. So he did, and she sat in the car, waiting and waiting. All of a sudden she spotted something white wedged down in the crack of the seat on which her husband had been sitting. "Here it is," she cried. "I found the present. I'll just run back and call him down. I have a key." She hurried out of the car and up the steps to the front door, holding the key in one hand. She slid the key into the keyhole and was about to turn it, but then she stopped. Her head came up, and she put her ear to the door and listened intently. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. She stood there absolutely motionless. Then all at once she sprang back to life again, withdrew the key from the door, and came running down the steps. "It's too late," she cried to the chauffeur. "I can't wait for him. He'll have to get a cab to go to his club. I'll miss the plane. Hurry now, driver, hurry, to the airport." With Mrs. Foster urging him from the back seat, the man drove fast all the way, and she caught her plane with just a few minutes to spare. Soon she was high up over the Atlantic, reclining comfortably in her seat, heading for Paris at last. She met her grandchildren, and they were even more beautiful in the flesh than in their photographs. Every day she took them for walks, fed them cakes, bought them presents, and told them charming stories. Once a week, on Thursdays, she wrote a letter to her husband. She never received a reply. When the 6 weeks were up, she sent her husband a cable and caught the plane back to New York. At the airport there was no car to meet her, so she got herself a taxi. When they had arrived at her house, the driver helped her with her luggage. She paid and tipped him and rang the bell. She waited, but there was no answer. So just to be sure, she rang again. She heard it ring at the back of the house, but still no one came. So she took out her own key and let herself in. There was a great pile of mail lying on the floor beneath the letterbox, and the place was dark and cold. The atmosphere was peculiarly oppressive, and there was a faint, curious odour in the air that she'd never smelt before. She walked quickly through the hall and went round the corner to the lift at the back. When she returned a few seconds later, there was a slight glimmer of satisfaction on her face. She went into her husband's study, found a little address book on the desk. After hunting through it for a while, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Hello," she said. "This is 9 East 62nd Street. "Yes, that's right. Could you send someone round as soon as possible?" "Yes, it seems to be stuck again between the second and third floor. At least, that's where the indicator is pointing." "Right away?" "Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much. Goodbye." She replaced the receiver and sat there at her husband's desk, patiently waiting for the man, who would be coming soon to repair the lift.